Hey everyone, Coach Micah here. Welcome back to the channel. On today's episode of Theory Thursday, we will be continuing our series looking at how we can bolster constructive arguments and of course the framework of a constructive case. Before we continue, make sure you hit that subscribe button and of course smash that like button. I love what I do and I love being able to create content for you, and your support means the world to me. Now without further ado, let's get straight into the video. It is time to continue our construction project. In the last two videos, we have built our foundation with the pre-value framework and of course the value. And in those two videos, I showed you how good values work, what they look like, what they need in order to succeed, and of course how you can narrow down the resolution to make it more advantageous for you. That includes defining the terms in a certain way and of course narrowing it through an analysis point or two. So once we have done that, we now need to start bringing up the analysis that proves that the value has been upheld and of course is in line with our definitions. And the way that we do this is through an argument called a contention. Now, I'm going to be showing you later exactly how a contention should look within a case, but we first need to understand what is part of the post-value framework. We've talked about the pre-value framework, what comes before the value. We've looked at what makes a good value. Now we need to look at the post-value framework, how the analysis, real-world examples, and any other pieces of evidence or clarification work. The main argument that everybody will know is, of course, the contention. But what exactly is a contention, and why does it necessarily contain any of these extra things? So just to put it really simply, a contention is the name of the argument. It's the name that we give to an argument or the collection of arguments that we're making that either support my side, support your side, or refute your opponent's side. A subpoint, which is a way of categorizing arguments within a contention, is of course the specific take on an argument that you're making. And we'll take a look at what that means here in just a second. Now, generally, subpoints are used because there are multiple layers to an overarching argument that you are giving. Another key part of a contention that a lot of people actually miss is the rhetoric. Before you get into any example, you have to first explain in your own words with your persuasion and your skills, your logic, right? You need to be able to explain the argument that you are making before you bring up any examples for it. And that, of course, is your rhetoric. Once you've stated your position, you might even think of it as like giving a thesis. Once you have stated your position, you then get to back it up with some real world evidence. And we would call this an application or an example. A real world example proves the argument that you are making. And of course, we end or should end every contention we make with a nice little bow using an impact, which essentially talks about the significance of your argument. It answers the question of all the things that you said, why does it matter? Why does the argument matter? Why does the last 2 minutes that you spent saying words matter, right? So if you include all of these things to some degree, you're going to have a really strong contention. Now, let's look at how to write your contentions. The contentions that you create are actually dependent on the type of resolution that you are debating. There are two types of values resolution, although you'll see similar structures in other forms of debate. Essentially, there are two types of resolutions. The first is known as a comparative resolution, and you've heard me talk about it on this channel before, but a comparative resolution is where you compare two or more things to some standard, right? Take the resolution that we are currently dealing with right now, incrementalism and radicalism. We are comparing two things, making this a comparative resolution. When I first did LD, the resolution was preemptive warfare is morally justified. We're not actually comparing two things, we're instead trying to prove a statement. And that makes it a bright line resolution. And you can see the different case structures right here, at least with the contentions, right? You have on the left side, if incrementalism is superior to radicalism, and you have your value, let's say of human rights, then your contentions are going to compare both subjects of the resolution to the value. And it's really important, so I'm going to say it again. In a comparative resolution, the contentions will look at both of and compare the subjects of the resolution to the value. So if you're ever struggling to figure out what am I going to write as my contention tag, right? The words that you tell the judge to write down on their flow. What are you going to tell them to write? Well, it depends on what your value is. And of course, you have to look at the subject of the resolution. So we show here that our value is human rights. So that must mean that our contention 1 is that incrementalism upholds human rights. I'm making arguments showing that I uphold the value. My second contention is a mirror of that and says radicalism doesn't uphold human rights. Because if we're talking about superiority, only one can uphold the value. If they both uphold the value, then none is superior. So logically, it follows that if incrementalism upholds human rights, then that must mean radicalism doesn't uphold human rights. Now, with a bright line resolution, you don't necessarily have to have a mirrored contention because you're not comparing one thing to another thing. Instead, you're solely just giving and showing your side of the resolution upholds the value. Your opponent would then come and show how it doesn't uphold that value, right? So if you look at the case structure right here, you have the idea, let's say we had the value of life. I'm gonna have several contentions. I could have 1, I could have 2, I could have 3 or 4. The contentions are going to aid in showing the different areas in which I support life. So contention 1, preemptive warfare protects civilians. That's one form of life, right? Contention 2, preemptive warfare protects the military. So now I'm protecting their lives. Contention 3, preemptive warfare prevents further conflict, right? These are all different ways, all different arguments that I am making that prove that I am protecting life. There are 2 different ways that your contention can be organized, so let's look at the first one. If you are going to go the route of using subpoints, some people really like this route, some people don't. I will say subpoints are extra tags that the judge has to keep track of, and many people choose to include applications with their subpoints. So let me just preface, you want to, of course, be as clear as possible. You don't want to confuse the judge. You don't want to bring up any unnecessary argumentation. You don't want them to run out of space on their paper and be unable to record anything else that you say. So use them wisely. But this is an example of what a contention might look like if you are using a subpoint structure. Of course, I start at the very top with my contention tag. Incrementalism upholds general welfare. And we're just assuming that this is the affirmative case and our value is general welfare, right? I will start with some rhetoric, and the rhetoric is going to actually be the longer version of my tag. So instead of my rhetoric being incrementalism upholds general welfare, let's see this in my first subpoint, I'm instead going to explain my position a little bit. I might say, societies are extremely complex. Because a functioning society requires so many inputs, taking swift, sweeping action will be counterproductive because you'll end up ruining the social order. When there's a problematic part of social life, the process of incrementalism allows for a fix without harming other parts of society. Now, you'll notice in that rhetoric, I actually give a nod to the position that my opponent is, or I'm at least telling the judge what my opponent is going to say, or the position that they have to hold as the negative side. And I'm showing how now their side is going to ruin it, but actually my side is going to be better. I'm not going to use the word radicalism. I'm just using the vague idea of what radicalism is to create a juxtaposition in which I come out on top as incrementalism. And then I'm going to give an example of this with my subpoint. So my argument here is that incrementalism allows for a fix without harming parts of society. Subpoint A considers consequences. So the subpoints are showing you what I mean, showing you the different areas of how we know it fixes without harming society. So subpoint A considers consequences. Incremental change happens gradually for a reason. Every action has consequences, so when a society is changed, a domino effect happens. Incremental change takes those consequences into account before acting. And once the action is taken towards a goal, the cycle repeats, allowing for change to happen while society stays orderly. Let's take a look at that for a second. I'm saying that this is a way we know we can fix society without harming it. And we do this because we consider each step and the effect that it's going to have on the rest of the process. So before we do anything, we need to make sure we take that careful step. Now, we can assume that my definitions talked about incrementalism being gradual and step by step. So the logic follows here, right? And I might have another example. Subpoint B is easily reversible. Following on that same theme, incremental changes are minor enough to reverse if there's a poor reaction to it. Sometimes a change looks good on paper but doesn't work in the real world. So incrementalism is superior because it can adapt and reverse itself easily. So there are two ways that incrementalism can fix a society without harming society. Considering the consequences, going nice and slow, making sure it doesn't overstep. And then, of course, if something does go awry, we can take a step back and try again. It allows us to be very careful. It allows us to be conservative. It allows us to not ruin anything, right? And this is where I get into my impact. So why does all this argumentation matter? Why do these subpoints matter? How are they strong? Well, it's because they show that incrementalism is superior. Because incrementalism allows for necessary change to happen while preserving social order, it is therefore superior. You can think of a contention as a logical syllogism within the logical syllogism that is your case. I start out with the tag, I then have my rhetoric that is just me presenting my position. I then have my subpoints that explain that position, in this case in two different ways. Some people like to have 3 or more subpoints. Remember, you are pressed on time and you want to make sure your arguments are impactful. So I would recommend staying at 2 or following the second contention structure that we'll look at here in a second. I show my subpoints and then of course I wrap it all up with an impact that brings the subject I was just talking about to the resolution, right? So what does it mean? Incrementalism upholds general welfare. Well, that must mean that it's superior, because if the way we determine superiority is through my value of general welfare, and we know that incrementalism upholds general welfare, then that must mean that incrementalism is superior. Although LD is inherently philosophical, you still need to have some evidence, in my opinion. We're going to use the application structure. Now, I just want to preface, you can have both subpoints and applications in the same contention, but this is just for helping you understand how I might structure a contention solely based off of these. With an application structure, I'm once again going to start with my tag, incrementalism upholds general welfare. I'm going to have my rhetoric. This time it's the exact same as my previous slide here, but now I'm going to bring up an example of this. So if I end my sentence with, when there is a problematic part of social life, the process of incrementalism allows for a fix without harming other parts of society. And we see this in the real world through my example of healthcare. One of the largest pressing issues within society is the issue of healthcare. An incremental approach to healthcare looks like adapting to the needs of generations as they grow older and as society grows. Imagine if every time change was needed, we just created a new healthcare system. Instead of this radical approach, policies are added onto the structure when needs arise, allowing for society to continue to function. Let's take a step back here. Did you notice some of the rhetoric that was used in that contention? First off, I did, in fact, name radicalism as a problem here. I started as kind of this broad nod to radicalism. Imagine if every time we needed to change something, we just completely replaced the healthcare system. That idea of creating that idea of replacement, that would assume that my definitions are probably talking about the differences between radicalism and incrementalism, and the idea that incrementalism fixes and radicalism replaces, right? So, and this makes sense as we looked at my rhetoric prior to the application. Anyways, I say, well, instead of the radicalism approach, we use incrementalism, and that has worked. So therefore, my impact, incrementalism is superior. Incrementalism addresses the needs of a society without having to replace the institutions every time a problem arises, making it the superior means of change. So basically what I'm saying here is that if you have to replace something and it causes all these problems, then it's not superior. But instead, we don't need to replace things, we just need to fix things. We need to alter things. We need to change some things around, and that's what incrementalism is best at. Therefore, incrementalism is superior. Now, when it comes to contention 2, because we know that we're supposed to be supporting our side with our first contention. What does contention 2 look like? How do you build an argument against your opponent's side, right? Well, first you want to continue comparing to the value. So contention tag 1 is that incrementalism, your side of the resolution, upholds the value. Tag 2 for the second contention is that radicalism does not uphold the value. My side does, their side doesn't. The next thing I'm going to do is mirror the contention that I brought up for my side. So if I had 2 subpoints, then my second contention will also have 2 subpoints, and they're going to be the same measurements, right? Subpoint A, incrementalism considers the consequences. For the second contention, subpoint A, radicalism forgoes the consequences. So we're comparing the consequence argument. Radicalism actually doesn't care about the consequences. It acts without thinking. And because of that, we can therefore assume, dangerous, right? Same thing with the second subpoint. Incrementalism is reversible. Radicalism is not reversible. So you'll see how, just like I'm doing with the contentions, contention 1, I uphold, contention 2, they do not uphold, these subpoints are also being mirrored. I achieve these aspects, they do not achieve these aspects, or they violate these aspects. And therefore the impact is also mirrored. Impact, I achieve the value. Impact, they don't achieve the value. And we'll also take a look at how that works here in a second too. And the same thing goes for the example, the application. If I bring up a real world example of how my how my side is true, or how it's good, or how it works, there's actually 2 things that I can do. I can either, 1, apply my side to that same example and show how they would have ruined it. So that basically says that I'm superior because my side was the good part of it, and the bad part of it is thanks to my opponent's side. Or I can show a different example that is equally strong as the example and shows how my opponent's side is bad. Now you'll notice I did a little bit of that first option in that last contention. Let's actually go back here. I talked about how within the application of healthcare, my side of the resolution is the reason healthcare is so great in this country. But if we had used radicalism within our healthcare system, it would have ruined it, right? So I'm using that as an application to do both, to show why my side upholds the resolution and also why my opponent's side does not. So these are the 3 things that you are going to do when comparing the 2 contentions, when comparing the 2 sides of the debate. Now, here are a couple tips to make your contentions as strong as possible, because you want to make sure that you take every advantage given to you through your constructive, right? You only have so much time in an LD round to bring up constructive arguments, because once the constructives are done and you're going into rebuttals, you may not bring up any new constructive arguments. That would be against the rules. So how do we take advantage of our constructive? Well, we need to make sure we have at least 1 example, if not more. And I would even say it's a good practice to have several examples on the ready for you to use if you need to bolster your arguments. Because although you cannot make a new argument past the constructives, you can continue to bring up example after example after example that proves the argument that you've already made. That is not against the rules, so make sure you have, I would recommend, at least 3 different examples ready. You can use those in further speeches. If you're going with the subpoint route, then you want to make sure that I think it's strong to have at least 2 subpoints, or if you want to do 1 subpoint, have an application or a real world example to go with that subpoint. And the reason is a subpoint can be strong, and it's only as strong as your rhetoric, which means if you're not really strong when it comes to the words that you use, and you're the type of person that wants to rely heavily on evidence, then you're going to want to use evidence, because the judge can only believe you so much, right? If you're using your subpoints in order to make logical claims that make sense, but you don't back it up with real world examples, and your opponent comes in and they says, "Judge, they didn't back it up with real world examples," well, then you're kind of stuck. So this is why I recommend either having multiple subpoints that you can build up these different logical ideas on top of each other to make them stronger, or bring up an application for every subpoint that you have. You never want to just have a contention, one subpoint, and then move on without any example. That would be the weakest. And of course, an even weaker, I guess, would just having your contention, then only having rhetoric and then moving on. I'm sure your opponent is going to come up and argue that you brought up no examples or no real-world proof of your quote-unquote hypothetical claims, right? And so that's why you want to make sure you have examples on the ready, even with subpoints, or of course have multiple subpoints. Now, of course, I want to remind you, when you are writing your constructive, right, this is the time where you can actually write things word for word. You don't necessarily have to think on the fly for them. You need to make sure that you're, one, using simple words. There's no reason to try to best your opponent in the battle of vocabulary. You're trying to persuade. You're trying to get the judge to, one, like you, but also vote for you. So why would you use words that would alienate them from that? And I'm not saying you have to speak to them like a baby, but you need to speak to them like a person. You need to speak to them like you're having a conversation. You're not debating the judge. You're presenting to the judge. You are speaking to the judge, not at them. So use simple words when you're crafting your case. Also, make sure you present that you have a clear understanding of your own arguments. This is why rhetoric is so important before your examples or your subpoints. Yes, you have the tag, Contention 1, incrementalism upholds human rights. But if you just jump straight into an application, you're missing a really good opportunity to prove to the judge why it upholds human rights. Not how, but why. Why does it uphold human rights? What works about it? If there were no real-world examples, how would it uphold human rights? What about incrementalism or what about radicalism upholds human rights? So that's why you need your rhetoric, because it shows that you have a clear understanding. And of course, when you have a contention, you need to have an impact. You need to show that your side of the resolution is significant. You need to show that your arguments are significant, that your evidence is significant, that your rebuttals are significant. You should always be asking yourself, and of course the judge, why does this matter? Why is this important? Why did I spend so much time on this? Because it's the most important part of the round. Because it's the most important part of this. Because if this is wrong, then the consequences are this. Because if this is correct, then I win the round, right? Why does it matter? Simple words, clear understanding, significant argumentation. That is how you craft a good, strong contention. That is a wrap on today's episode of Theory Thursday. I want to thank you all so much for your support. For those of you who are subscribed or like the videos, I really appreciate it. It means the world to me. I love creating content for you. And of course, I have a lot of really fun ideas for videos down the line. If this series was helpful, then go ahead and check out my Mars Hill series. I release videos every Monday regarding Mars Hill topics and showing you how to get the best analysis from the pieces given to us via the Mars Hill questions. If you have any other questions or any ideas for future videos, I would appreciate some feedback in the comments below. You could also reach out to me at coachmicahdiaz@gmail.com. Anyways, until then, I will see you next Thursday. Have a wonderful weekend.